Thank you all for coming together this morning to speak a bit about the COVID-19 pandemic and where we are with the vaccination campaign. Rich, I'm interested in your perspective on the safety of the vaccine. Folks often have hesitancy around the rapid development, and I want to get your perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I think overall, the thing we should be driving home with our patients is these are very safe vaccines, well tolerated. Even though, no vaccine and nothing in medicine is 100% safe, it's important to keep in mind that these vaccines are for a new disease, but are quite well tolerated. There have been some rare events that have popped up in the news, but it'll be important to keep in mind as we speak to patients and family members that, these events are quite rare. 1 in 100,000 or maybe even less as we see this going forward. So it's important to keep in mind that those really kind of severe ones that might get some press attention are a bit less common in patients who receive the vaccine. The big things to keep in mind with this vaccine are that it's a reactogenic vaccine, so that it's kind of cause maybe some discomfort for a day or two after. So expecting maybe some aches, some chills, maybe a mild, very mild fever that reacts well to ibuprofen or acetaminophen. And can really kind of, overall be well managed for those patients. The other most common side effect people are, mentioning up front right now, both anecdotally and in the data, is some injection site discomfort as well, expecting that to maybe go through about for 12 to 24 hours. And 1% of patients actually say it's quite painful. So keeping that in mind, making sure we set expectations for patients is really important. In general, I think the other thing to keep in mind too is that some of the other side effects we see with vaccines in general, like Bell's palsy, so a numbness or a tingling on one side of the face, that might even lead to some drooping, and also the Guillain-Barré syndrome are also pretty rare with these agents. So keeping in mind that the very severe things, like I mentioned before, are quite rare, and that you expect some of the general type vaccine-related discomforts after vaccination. And keeping in mind also, as this is a new agent that was developed this year, and in a really response to a pretty massive project, we're going to continue to monitor any events that occur and make sure that data gets shared out through the vaccine adverse event reporting system that the CDC and the FDA use to monitor for those symptoms that might pop up. So we'll keep an eye on any emerging trends as well. And I think another thing to keep in mind here is we'll continue to see some development of efficacy related data as we go forward from here. So I think Dr. Mock maybe could speak a little bit about that to us as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I think something to keep in mind is that oftentimes we'll talk about how quickly these vaccines were developed. We need to remember a lot of these vaccines really have been, the technologies behind the vaccines have been studied and developed over many years. They were just technologies waiting for appropriate application. And an analogy that I kind of like to talk about with these vaccines is kind of like developing the GPS for your immune system. The scientific community really were just waiting for an application for it. So in this particular case, they were just looking, as soon as we know what the spike protein on the coronavirus looks like, the pharmaceutical company were able to very quickly plug in that address into the GPS to kind of tell your immune system where to start producing the immunity against the COVID-19. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that historically, a lot of the vaccines and pharmaceutical studies were done in sequential phases. They would complete phase 1 before moving on to phase 2 and then moving on to phase 3. In this particular scenario, we were able to do these studies concurrently. Some of the phase 1 and 2 overlap each other, and similarly, phase 2 and 3 overlap each other. That's not to say that we necessarily had skipped any steps or cut any corners. It's just that the historical way of drug development is utilizing the sequential approach to mitigate a financial risk, because in case phase 2 didn't pan out, they wouldn't have spent the money to do the phase 3. In this particular case, we see that we have either government intervention or where we have such a huge demand, the pharmaceutical companies have decided that the payoff is worth it to run the trials simultaneously. In fact, the studies for the 2 vaccines that are currently approved or under emergency use or authorization in the US had results that are so remarkable in the mid-90s efficacy rate that they were able to conclude the studies early because they were able to reach their clinical endpoints. In other words, the number of infections prevented or the severe infections being able to be prevented much earlier than they had anticipated. So we're really happy to see these vaccines being available to protect the community out there. With that said, Matt, maybe you can talk a little bit about how people can go about getting these vaccines.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. There's a lot of confusion right now about how to seek vaccination in your local community, and it's important to realize that each state has its plan for distribution throughout the community, and so it's important to seek local guidance relative to where you live and in your own community. The goal is for everyone to get vaccinated as quickly as possible in a safe manner. The manufacturers of each vaccine are working hastily to generate as many doses as they can and get those out to the local governments. It's important to examine where you fit per local guidance. So I would recommend reaching out to your local or state health departments to see what their tiered schedule is for rollout. It's also important, if you have a primary care physician, perhaps to consult them for your own local circumstances and see if you have any reason why you should pursue vaccination in a different manner. And it's also important to seek guidance from what's natural for you. So if there's local news outlets you're used to consulting, in all likelihood, they'll have guidance for you on how to pursue an appointment. The logistics within your community are going to differ. Many communities are on an appointment schedule, and based on where you fall in the rollout schedule, you'll want to seek an appointment as quickly as possible so that you know where to go and when to arrive and how to seek vaccination responsibly. It's important to realize that each vaccine involves 2 doses. So it's critically important that you don't forget to receive your second dose, which is a number of weeks after your initial dose. That confers a particular boost to your immunity that provides protection long-term from COVID-19. So it's definitely not a one and done shot. So please complete the entire series. It's also important to realize if you've had COVID-19 already during the pandemic, that's not a replacement for vaccination. The natural immunity conferred through natural infection is not a replacement. So please consider getting vaccinated regardless of whether you've had the infection already. So as a fellow epidemiologist, Mackenzie, I'm also interested in your perspective on where we go from here and the long-term vision for the end of this pandemic.
Yeah, so I'm just happy that we're actually able to talk about vaccinations at this point in the pandemic. Vaccinations are going to play a central role in our ability to return to some level of normalcy. And we've seen so far with the pandemic a lot of change and increase at alarming rates. So we have to combat the viral transmission that we've seen so far using all of the prevention and control strategies that we know about, which includes immunization. And some may think, well, I can, obtain immunity through infection, but I will say that natural immunity through infection poses such a serious risk to so many people that it's not the safest and is not the preferred bet. Obtaining immunity through vaccination is by far the safest option for immunity. And that's by far what's preferred and recommended by our experts. Vaccination, not only helps to protect us, but it also helps to protect our loved ones and our communities at large. It's going to be critical in helping to limit transmission from person to person in our communities, as well as limiting overall disease prevalence. What we've seen already, is that vaccine rollout is going to be a process, and vaccine uptake will take time. But even if you are vaccinated, or even if you're planning to get vaccinated, it is not a perfect fix. It's going to be critical that we pair vaccination with all of the other evidence-based precautions that we know work, and keep those in practice moving forward, including wearing a mask, practicing social distancing, having impeccable hand hygiene, as well as practicing any other measures recommended by our experts. And lastly, I just say that, we've seen how quickly recommendations do change. And it's always based on evidence. And as we get that information in, our public health officials and experts are able to make recommendations for all of us so that we can move forward as a united front. So I'll just say, just stay tuned, remain informed, and keep yourself, as safe as possible moving forward. And hopefully at some point we can have a new normal.